In the latest episode of Secrets of the Dead, host Sarah Parkak introduces us to one of the greatest mysteries in archaeology. Who built the first civilization in Egypt? We've been hearing about the mighty pharaohs for centuries now. They're often synonymous with ancient Egypt itself. But the truth is, they only ruled over a small portion of Egyptian history. There was more than 2,000 years of pre-dynastic Egypt before the first pharaoh emerged. And we still have no idea who built the first great cities, invented their way of writing, or established the foundations of their culture. So join me as we examine the archaeological evidence and find out who came to Egypt before the pharaohs. As always, if you're watching this, please do us all a favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that videos like this are interesting and helps us get them out to even more people. Ancient Egypt is the longest-lasting civilization in human history, dating back to around 3100 BCE and lasting until the Arab conquest in 640 CE. Egyptian civilization lasted for a staggering 3,150 years. And yet, when most people think of ancient Egypt, they're thinking of a much smaller fraction of that timeline. Most people think of the New Kingdom, which only represents 600 of those 3,000-plus years. This era is notable because of some of the most famous rulers in human history: Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramses II, and so on. During this time, Egypt was a major international player, controlling huge swaths of the Levant and Nubia and launching military campaigns as far away as modern-day Libya and North Pakistan. The later New Intermediate period saw the emergence of the last native Egyptian dynasty before the country was conquered by foreign invaders. Then came the Persians, the Ptolemaic kingdom, and finally the Roman annexation of Egypt in 30 BCE. The story of post-Akhenaten Egypt is certainly an important one, but it's not the focus of this video. Instead, we want to go back to the very beginning and ask, who built the foundations of this long-lasting civilization? To answer this question, we have to go back to the start of Egyptian civilization in the Nile River Valley and ask, what was life like before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler? Today, the Cairo Museum contains thousands of artifacts from this period known as Pre-Dynastic Egypt. Some of these date back to the very beginnings of Egyptian culture, around 6,000 years ago. At that time, the eastern and western banks of the Nile were home to a series of small chiefdoms. Each was independent and culturally distinct from the others. Life was difficult in this frontier region where the Sahara Desert meets the fertile Nile Valley. In order to survive, these early Egyptians had to learn how to farm the unpredictable land and defend themselves against nomadic desert tribes. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, however, the climate changed, and the Sahara became less hospitable, forcing even more people into the Nile Valley. With more people came more competition for resources, and according to many historians, this struggle for resources along the Nile eventually led to the emergence of the first pharaohs. But who exactly were these first Egyptians, and how did they lay the foundations of this new society? According to Egyptian tradition, it was King Minos who unified Upper and Lower Egypt and established the first dynasty. But as we explained in our previous episode, this isn't actually true. Despite what you may have heard, there wasn't a single moment in Egyptian history known as the Egyptian or the Naqada Revolution. Instead, the process of cultural unification was much longer and more complex. Over many centuries, the people of Upper and Lower Egypt gradually came to share common customs, art styles, religions, and eventually political structures. Still, sometime during the late 4th millennium BCE, perhaps around 3100 BCE, a powerful king from Upper Egypt named Narmer or possibly Aha united the region. This event marked the beginning of the early dynastic period and the start of the first dynasty. Aha's successors, such as Gem and Kot, continued to expand the borders of Egypt and solidify their rule. Many new settlements were founded across the Nile, and the population grew rapidly. By the end of the first dynasty, Egypt was unrecognizable from the small chiefdoms that had existed just a few hundred years earlier. The first pharaohs had established a stable state ruled by a powerful king who owned all the land and controlled the wealth of the nation. These early pharaohs also standardized weights and measures, reformed the calendar, and created a system of government that would last for centuries. But while the pharaohs were undoubtedly a powerful force in Egyptian society, they were not the only important people around. Also emerging during this time were nomarchs, regional officials who acted as governors and judges. Together, the nomarchs and the pharaohs formed the governing class of early Egyptian society. However, at this stage of their development, Egyptian society was still largely egalitarian. Unlike later periods, there were no slaves and the majority of the population lived comfortable lives working as farmers or artisans. All of this changed, however, when Egypt entered its second dynasty, marking the start of the Old Kingdom. During the fourth dynasty, the Egyptian economy boomed due to unprecedented agricultural production. The population reached approximately 2 million people, and Memphis became one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The wealth and influence of the Egyptian elite increased significantly, and a new social class of nobles emerged, all owing fealty to the pharaoh. This growing inequality led to a more stratified society with the pharaoh at the top, followed by the nobles, then scribes, artisans, farmers, and finally slaves. This rigid social hierarchy would define Egyptian society for thousands of years. The wealth of the elite was symbolized by their lavish burials. As we learned in our previous episode, the earliest pyramids were built during the latter half of the fourth dynasty as elaborate tombs for the pharaohs. While many people believe that pyramid building continued throughout the Old Kingdom, this isn't entirely accurate. Pyramids as burial structures were abandoned after the fifth dynasty, although the next two dynasties continued to build large step pyramids and mastaba tombs for the elite. The Old Kingdom ended abruptly around 21 to 81 BCE with the collapse of the sixth dynasty and the death of Teti. This event, known as the First Intermediate Period, saw Egypt descend into chaos and civil war. Much of the country descended into anarchy, while rival rulers struggled to maintain control over the central regions of the Nile. Some scholars speculate that this instability was caused by severe drought, famine, and economic decline. Others blame it on outside invasions by groups such as the Hyksos, a collection of foreign peoples who settled in the eastern Nile Delta. Whatever the cause, Egypt would not emerge from this dark age until the 11th dynasty and the reunification of the country under Mentuhotep II. So far, we've examined a lot of Egyptian history, but the big question remains: who were the Egyptians? Were they indigenous people who evolved naturally over thousands of years? Or were they the descendants of Middle Eastern invaders who swept into the Nile Valley and conquered the local population? Unfortunately, the archaeological record has not provided us with a definitive answer. While some scholars argue that pre-dynastic Egyptians evolved organically from the indigenous people of the region, others contend that the cultural similarities between Egypt and the Near East suggest a close relationship. Unfortunately, without any written records from this period, it's impossible to know for sure. But the good news is that we'll soon be able to test our current theories. Thanks to recent advances in DNA technology, scientists are now able to extract genetic material from ancient mummies and compare their DNA to modern populations. If they find that the ancient Egyptians were genetically distinct from other contemporary populations, then it would support the theory that they evolved independently. However, if they find that they were more closely related to Mesopotamian or Nubian populations, then it would lend credence to the invasion hypothesis. These results could revolutionize our understanding of Egyptian history and shed new light on the origins of one of the world's oldest civilizations. So who built the first civilization in Egypt? Well, the simple answer is that we don't know. The truth is, it wasn't one group of people, but rather a gradual evolution of cultures over thousands of years. What we do know is that the earliest Egyptians were a proud and resilient people who were able to adapt to the challenges of their environment and create one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. So while we may never know the true identity of the first Egyptians, we can appreciate the legacy they left behind and marvel at the ingenuity that allowed them to thrive for so many centuries. Thank you for watching. Have you enjoyed learning more about pre-dynastic Egypt? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more episodes of Secrets of the Dead.